So, Hebrews chapter 2, we're not going to read just yet. If you remember last time, we sort of ended at verse 4 or so. But we're going to pick up from last time, and just by a quick recap of where we were last time. If you remember, the author of Hebrews goes to great lengths to highlight to a Jewish Christian audience. Now, it's called Jewish Christians. They are Christians, but they were Jews. They were part of the Jewish tradition. They were children of Abraham. They could trace their ancestry right back to one of the sons of Jacob. They knew which tribe they were in. They were steeped in the Old Testament and the law and the prophets. They knew it back to front. But they're now following Jesus. They're now Jesus followers. But they have to, there's a cultural shift. You know yourself, it's hard when you go into a new culture, different culture, just to change how you think about things. And so they've got this background of the Old Testament, and they need to try and figure out how Jesus fits in with that. And that's what the author of Hebrews is trying to do. Trying to tell them, listen, here's how Jesus fits in with all of that. And actually, as we noticed last time, Jesus is better than all the things that you were looking at in the Old Testament. He's better than the law. He's better than the angels. He's superior to all of these things. And that was chapter 1, if you remember that from last time. Now we're in chapter 2, and the author picks up on a question that might be on some people's minds as they are reading this or as they're hearing it being read. And the question might be this: hang on a second. If Jesus is superior than the angels, how come he was human? Because last time I checked, humans aren't superior to the angels. In a sense, there seems to be a hierarchy. There's God, the angels, humans. So maybe that's on your mind as well, maybe not. But as the author is, in a sense, preempting this question, because they might be thinking that, hang on a second. Jesus is more superior than the angels. How come he was human? Because humans aren't superior to the angels. And that's what's being tackled in chapter 2 in this next section, which fascinated me. And as I said on Sunday, it answers the question that we have talked about before, I think, in some ways. Why did Jesus have to become a human? Because since God can do anything he wants, couldn't he just say, do you know what? I'll forgive you. You're forgiven. You know, I love you so much, I'm just going to forgive you. Why couldn't God do that? Why did Jesus have to actually come to earth and die if God could just do that? Well, to answer that question in a sense before we go into the text, we've got to remember that God, being God, can't do anything that goes against his character. Okay? Got to remember that. So while God is a God of love and mercy and grace, he's also a God of justice. And we've got to remember he is a God of justice and a God of wrath. There's punishment for those who sin. And if he lets us all go without punishment, or without any punishment being given for sin, then he wouldn't be a just God. Because there's the wages of sin is death. There's wages to be paid for sin. And if he says, you know what, you're all forgiven, and those wages aren't paid, then the books don't balance. Does that make sense? There has to be, if God's a just God, if we sin and the wages of sin is death, for anyone who sins, there must be a penalty of death for someone. Of course, enter Jesus Christ, who came down to earth to pay that punishment for us. So in order for God to be able to forgive us for the sin that was passed down to us from the first human, Adam, some human had to face death, a human that never sinned. Because I can't pay the price for your sin because I've got my own sin to pay. You can't pay the price for someone else's sin because you've got your own sin to pay. The only person who can pay the price for someone else's sin, or the only human, is someone who hasn't sinned. Had to be Jesus. So Jesus had to become human in order to satisfy God's justice, and he died on our behalf to satisfy his love and his grace, which is a beautiful picture. So look at verse 5 then of chapter 2. We'll read a few verses and then we'll stop and have a chat about them. So verse 5 of Hebrews 2, the author writes, "It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking. But there is a place where someone has testified This is Psalm 8, by the way. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? A son of man that you care for him. You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. In other words, they rule over everything. They're over everything. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to them. Now that seems to be a bit awkward. That's a bit wordy, and let me try and explain what's going on here. The Jews held the angels in very high regard. Angels were messengers from God. In fact, that's what the Greek word angelos, which we translate as angel, that's what it means, messenger. So we have angels in high regard, and then we have you and I, humans, who are lower than the angels. We're not as great as the angels. I think we can all say that. You know, someone who's really good, you might call them an angel, but they're not an actual angel. So there's angels, and then there's us who are lower than the angels. But that's not how it should be. We should be higher than the angels. In Genesis, think about it, God created man and woman to rule with him in the garden. Everything was to be subject to us. In other words, everything was to be under our rule alongside God. And angels weren't made in the image of God, but we are. But the fall came along and that knocked everything off kilter. But look at verse 8. That's what verse 8 says. At the minute, we aren't ruling over everything in the world like we're supposed to. Not everything is subject to us. It's supposed to be, but the fall has messed all that up. And at the minute, it's not the way it's supposed to be. Or it's not the way it is. But look at verse 5. The author is talking about the world to come. You see that there? The world to come. This is talking about the new creation, the new Jerusalem, the Garden of Eden that will be recreated in a sense and come down, where we will be crowned with glory and honor and rule with Jesus again. Okay? So that's what the author is saying, is we were made a little lower than the angels, but we will be crowned with glory, and we will be subject, or everything will be subject to us. We'll be ruling over it like we're supposed to. But it's not there yet, but it's going to happen in the world to come. But in order for that to happen, in order for us to be crowned with glory, our sin gets in the way of that, you see. We can't be crowned with glory in our sinful state. So someone had to come and redeem us from our sinful state, to rescue us, and that was Jesus. He came down to save us. And what Jesus had to do was become human as well. Look back at that quote from Psalm 8 in verse 6. It talks about humans being made lower than the angel, but it talks about the Son of Man, who Jesus talks about himself as the Son of Man. The Son of Man became lower than the angels as well. Now, why did this have to happen? Why did Jesus have to become human? Well, look at verse 9. We do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while. We see him now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Now again, what is that? What's he talking about there? Back to verse 9. Jesus was made a little lower than the angels for a short time when he was here on earth. And then he was crowned with glory when he was exalted. In other words, he was made human for a little while. But look at verse 9. So that he could suffer death, so that he could taste death for us. Because think about it, like I said earlier, the wages of sin is death. So if Jesus was to pay the price of sin, he had to die. Does that make sense, doesn't it? But Jesus is an immortal being. Angels are immortal beings. And so if Jesus had to die for us, he had to become less than immortal. He had to become mortal. He had to be able to die, which is why he had to come to earth as a human. This is sort of the basis of everything, that our salvation in a sense. He had to come to earth as a human because he had to be physically able to die. And so he had to strip himself of his, it says he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. He took on flesh and blood for us. And he couldn't become an angel to do it because the angels are immortal beings as well. He had to become a human. And this is why the incarnation is so important. It's what we celebrate at Christmas. Maybe I'll do a rehash of this at Christmas time. It's so important that Jesus came to earth as a human because he couldn't have paid the price for our sins any other way. The price of sin had to be paid because God is just. So in order for God to be able to pay that price, Jesus had to strip himself down, humble himself, and come as a human. Just think about that. Isn't that amazing? And he tasted death for everyone, it says. And so by doing so, he became our representative before God. It's a bit like your MP, I think. Now, I have no idea about politics at all, so don't ask me. But this is in my head. This is how politics works. The MP represents us in the House of Commons. Apparently, I looked it up. Had to Google this. It's awful. And I'm assuming they represent us in the House of Commons because we all can't be sitting in the House of Commons to argue our case. We want a zebra crossing outside the garage in Mosside, and we all can't be there arguing for our zebra crossing. So we nominate an MP to be our representative, to argue on our behalf. That's how I'm assuming it works. Maybe it doesn't work like that, but if it doesn't work like that, that's what's going on here. Jesus is our representative. He became human. He tasted death for everyone. He was our representative in death, dying in our place so that we don't have to die. Just like the MP represents us in the House of Commons so that we don't have to go and argue our case. Jesus was our representative. He died and tasted death so that we don't have to. He took our wages of sin on himself and balanced the books, allowing us to go free. And just like we don't have to go to Parliament to fight our case, and our MP does it, so we don't have to face death for our sins, because Jesus is our human representative, and we get the benefits of that representation, which is amazing. In verse 10, Jesus says, and becomes the pioneer. Now, this is mentioned later on in the book, and we'll come to that at some point again. He becomes the forerunner, the trailblazer. Like an explorer in the jungle, he takes a machete and cuts a path in the jungle for us to walk through. And because he represents us, and because he is holy, we get the benefits of that representation, and we become holy too. Look at verse 11. And the way, thinking back to an MP, a DUP MP represents DUP voters, constituents. A Sinn Féin MP represents the Sinn Féin people. Well, Jesus, and they're part of the same party. The DUP MP and the DUP voters, they're all part of the same party. They believe the same things. They're all together in this. Well, Jesus, as our representative, is holy. And so we become holy too, because we're all in it together. We're part of the same party. But look at verse 11, because it doesn't use the word party, it uses the word family. Well, brothers and sisters, both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy, that's us, are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters. And then we have some quotes after that from the Old Testament. The first one being Psalm 22, which speaks of Christ's death. The whole point of Psalm 22, it's all pointing forward to Christ's death. And the point of that psalm, because of Christ's death, is that, look at verse 12, that he will declare your name to his brothers and sisters. In the assembly, he will sing your praises. Jesus calls us brothers and sisters. We're part of his family. Now, this is how he can do that. Look at verse 14. Flesh, he was one of us. He was flesh and blood. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil. Jesus shared in our humanity so that his death as a human would break the power of death over humans. And the devil has the power of death over humans. The devil has us enslaved, and our ending is death. But Jesus became as one of us, took on flesh and blood to taste death for us, and take on the devil as our representative, freeing us from the fear of death. Let's look at verses 14 and 15 together. Since the children have flesh and blood, he also shared in their humanity. So since we have flesh and blood, he took on flesh and blood as well, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil. Verse 15, and free all those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. We do not need to fear death. We're not going to die. Physically, yes, we might fear the process of dying, but we do not need to fear death, thanks to Jesus Christ. He's freed us from that. Now, remember who's reading this. These are Christians who are steeped in the Old Testament, in the Judaism and in the law. So the author highlights how Jesus represents us in another way. And this is going to resonate with them big time. This is really going to hit home to them. Not so much maybe for us because we're not in that culture. But he brings up the topic of high priests. Okay, because the high priests represented God's people in the tabernacle, in the wilderness, and in Jerusalem in the temple. So look at verse 17. For this reason, and he said the angels can't do this, only Abraham's descendants. Verse 17, for this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way. He had to be made like us, fully human in every way, because the angels can't do this. Only descendants of Abraham are the representatives. So he had to become human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. See, angels weren't high priests. Humans were high priests, descendants of Abraham. So Jesus had to become a descendant of Abraham. To free us from the fear of death, he had to be like us, fully human, so that he might become our representative before God, and that's a high priest. They were the representatives in the Old Testament. They met God once a year to offer sacrifices for sin, and we're going to see it later on in the book. But the high priest represented the people and made atonement for the people. Once a year there was the atoning sacrifice that was made in the Holy of Holies. He went in, the high priest offered sacrifices for himself and then for the people, and he made atonement for their sins. He represented God's people before God himself, and that's what Jesus did. He took on the role of high priest, a perfect high priest, merciful and faithful high priest, so that he might make atonement for his people, standing as a representative of his people, taking on God's wrath on behalf of his people. Now, how does he make that atonement? Well, we'll find out later in the book, but it wasn't by sacrificing an animal, it was by becoming the atoning sacrifice himself. And again, he had to do this as a human because we need a human representative. We are tainted with the sin of the first human, Adam, which is why Jesus came as the last human, or the last Adam. Perfect human to represent us once and for all time. And you can't represent someone you don't have anything in common with. I can't represent Spain in the Olympics because I'm not Spanish. I have nothing to do with Spain. So Jesus became human, experienced what we experienced, was tempted in every way. Look at verse 18, but he didn't sin, so that he could represent us humans who were also tempted, but who did sin. It's almost like in this section, the author rewrites the story of the lost son. Remember the lost son, the prodigal son? There are two sons in that, and both were, in a sense, as bad as each other. In fact, the first son, the prodigal son, is the one who actually came to his senses, who was broken enough to come to the father and say, I need help. It's the older son who was the worst in that story. And the older son refused to come into the party at the end of the parable. He made a whole song and dance that his brother was scum, went out with prostitutes, and yet his father never even gave him a young goat so that he could celebrate with his friends. The older son was supposed to be the better person, but he wasn't in the story. But here we see Jesus as the perfect older brother who sees his younger brothers and sisters in need, who sees them in the pit of sin, destined for destruction. They're going, as people say, going to hell in a handbasket. It's like where we were. But he steps down, humiliates himself, so that we can enjoy the party in heaven. That's what Jesus did. I'm going to show you a clip here. because I think this describes what Jesus did very well. I want you to see this clip. Hopefully it will play okay for you.
Johnny has to win and to be sure of taking the title. And right now he seems to have lost control of his legs. And this is worrying. Oh, and he's starting to slow. And there is a little way to go. There's half a K to go. And Johnny is running out of time and is losing his sense of direction. This is worrying. Oh, goodness me. This is a horrible sight. Jonathan Brownlee has lost it now and has staggered to a stop at the side of the course, and Alistair's stopped to help him along. And Alistair is going to try and carry his brother home. Dramatic scenes in Cozumel as the Olympic champion carries his younger brother towards the podium.
Oh my God, I cannot believe what we are seeing here, Matt. Is this allowed? Is he allowed to help his brother? You know, is that part of the rules? I'm not too sure. We've never seen anything like this before.
Unbelievable scenes. Unbelievable scenes in Cozumel. The Brownlee brothers arm in arm, but it's not by way of celebration. Henry Schoeman's celebrating. He's going to win this race in Cozumel out of nowhere. But we have to be concerned about the health of Jonathan Brownlee, and they're not even on the final stretch yet. Schoeman wins in Cozumel. The brothers are coming home arm in arm to finish in second and third, but Johnny can hardly stand, and Alistair is having to drag him across the line and pushing him home for second. Johnny finishes in second. Goodness me, what an incredible conclusion here in Cozumel. I've never seen anything like that anywhere in world sport. Worrying scenes all round.
Jesus came down to earth to push us over the finish line. Isn't that tremendous? He sacrificed his own glory. He humbled himself to become like us in every way, to be able to sympathize with us, and he did it to represent us before the Father, to bring many sons and daughters to glory. What a Saviour we have.